Hey guys, I'm Dave and welcome to the Trull Gallery. Today, we're going to continue the build of this large built-in bookcase. This is the third installment of a large bookcase build, and if you haven't seen the first two videos, I'll add links to them below in the description. In this video, we're going to focus on the upper cabinets and the adjustable shelves. So let's see if we can get this build finally wrapped up. Before making a single cut on the upper cabinets, I took some time for some layout work. The first line on the narrow strip represents the top of the base cabinets. The top of the wider piece represents the ceiling height on my client's house. From there, I marked the lower edge of the crown molding, and with these located, I can now locate a few more key points. I marked the lower edge of the top face frame and the upper edge of the cabinet. By keeping the boxes short of the ceiling, I'll have room to install them and still have enough material up there to secure the crown molding to. There are a couple other thingies that I need to locate. The first is a special upper rail. This rail will hold a steel ladder rail so that they can access the upper cubbies. They'll use the same ladder that's in their kitchen, so I have to match the location. I also want to locate the top and lower fixed shelf. This is now a story stick that shows all the pertinent information for my sides, and it's finally time to start making some dust. Again, I used a website called Cut List Optimizer to determine the best layout and how many sheets of plywood I would need. When I picked up the 4 sheets of 3/4 inch birch ply, a couple of the sheets were a bit dinged up. I knew one of the sheets had a bit of waste stock, so I picked this sheet for that first cut. I trimmed off the damaged end with my shop-made circular saw jig, then cut the sheet a few inches longer than I needed, just in case. Now I could cut the 3 remaining full sheets and that 1 short sheet in half. This would be challenging at the table saw, so I used my Kreg rip cut and my circular saw. Next, I took 3 of the full-length strips and laid out the location for the 3 fixed shelves. Unlike the base cabinet video, I planned ahead here, and will be using some dados to support those shelves. I clamped the story stick in place, used a square to transfer the location of the 3 dados on one edge, then repeated the process on the other edge. To route the dados, I grabbed my adjustable router jig. If you'd like to see how I made that, or set it up, I'll add a link to the build video for that below. I lined up the edge of the jig with the upper layout line for the dado on each side, clamped it in place, and used my palm router with a template bit to cut a dado that's 1/4 inch deep. I went up one side, then down the other, and then ran a quick cleanup pass just in case. With the jig removed, a test piece of ply fits the dado just right. I repeated this process for all 3 dados on all 3 side pieces. With the dados cut and the side pieces a more manageable size, I could take them to the table saw. I set the fence to 12 inches and ripped each pair of sides in half. The pieces of blue tape on the ply are there to mark the panels, 1, 2, or 3, but they also let me know which edge is the center. This will help keep things aligned later. While I was here, I ripped down all the stock for the shelves as well, and this just makes everything more manageable later. Now that all my sides have at least 1 clean edge, I came back and trimmed them to their final width of 11¼ inches. This may seem like an extra step, but I get more control with the smaller panels than if I had just used those half sheets. And for the 6 sides, it only took a few extra minutes. I also cut enough stock for the fixed shelves, since they're the same width as the sides. Or are they? After ripping the sides to width, it's time to trim them to length. I clamped each pair together, transferred the cut line from my story stick, and then cut them down at the miter saw. I prefer to use a stop lock, but the sides are longer than my miter saw station, and this cut isn't critical as The top will be hidden behind the crown molding. Next up was cutting the fixed shelves to length. I need 30 inches between sides, and I have to account for those 2 1/4-inch dados in the sides. I squared one end of each panel at the miter saw, slide that in against my stop block, and cut the pieces to length. I needed 9 of these fixed shelves in total. Back to the table saw, I added a 3/8 inch wide dado set, a sacrificial fence to protect my blade, and a featherboard so I could cut the rabbets for the back panels. Some of the dado stack was buried in the fence, leaving me with a rabbet just under 1/4 inch wide, or the width of my stock. The blade was set to a 1/2 inch high so I'd have plenty of room to connect the backs later. I ran the 3 top pieces and all 6 sides. Switching back to a plywood blade, I ripped the inner fixed shelves to their final width. The back panels will sit flush against these shelves, so the dimension needs to be the same as the top panel from the front to the inside of that rabbet. This isn't a difficult glue-up, just a bit awkward, mostly because of the size of the parts. I started by placing the clamps close to each dado. Then I added a bead of glue in each one. I added the center shelf, the lower shelf, and then the top, carefully balancing each one in the clamps. The second side was dropped in, and I added just enough pressure to hold things in place. The second set of clamps were added, and with those I could make sure that the face of the shelves were even with the front edge of the sides. A tap or two of the mallet helped align things. Then the clamps could be tightened. I used my framing square to ensure that the case went together squarely. Once all the clamps were in place, I checked the case for square, did a little push-pull until the diagonals were the same, and now to do that 2 more times. While the glue was drying, I started on the adjustable shelves. They're still wider than they need them, and I'm cutting them about 1 inch oversized at the miter saw. All in, there were 15 adjustable shelves for the entire case. I don't want the plywood edge to show on the shelves, and I'm not a fan of most of the edge banding that's available today, so I set up my table saw to make my own. I have a thin curved 7 1/4 inch saw blade to save stock, and I set my fence to 3/16 of an inch. When everything is cleaned up, this should leave me with strips about 1/8 of an inch thick. Just make sure to use a push stick that you don't mind running through the saw blade. I also made a few more than I'll need, because I just know I'm going to lose some in the next step. I clamped the panel to my planer as a secondary bed, set the height for a light cut at my finishing speed, and ran the pieces through a few at a time. 2 or 3 passes were enough to clean them up, and sure enough, several strips were damaged in this process. A drum sander works much better for stuff like this. I made enough edge banding for the shelves and for the mounting rails, since those rails will be seen in the final product. I start with a bead of glue on one edge and spread it out for a good bond. Then I can add a strip, add the edge banding, and then repeat those 2 more times. Then I line things up, make sure the banding sits proud of the ply top and bottom, and tighten the clamps. The advantage of gluing multiple pieces together is the rails act as cawls for each other and distribute the clamping pressure more evenly. The shelves were done the same way, except I moved to longer clamps. Another difference here is that these strips were a little closer to 3/4 of an inch wide, so I used some blue tape to hold them in place before clamping them up. This prevents the banding from slipping out of alignment, leaving a gap on one of the edges. Once all the edges had been covered and the glue had time to dry, I had to trim off the excess edge banding. There are a lot of ways to get this done, and this is the one I chose. I clamped a parallel clamp to my table and used that to clamp the stock in place upright. Then I used a trim bit in my palm router. Went down one edge, then up the other. On some of the shelves, the banding was longer than the shelf, and I just ran the router around the end of the stock, and I wasn't overly concerned about a clean cut here, since the shelves are still longer than I need. After a bit of sanding, I took the mounting rails to the table saw and ripped them to their final width. An adjustment of the fence and the shelves were ripped to width as well. I took the rails back to the miter saw and cut one end square, then I set my stop to cut them to length. They should fit snugly between the case sides. I also made sure to cut from the front to the back. This would ensure any tear out happened on the back of the stock. The shelves will cut the same way with one extra step. Since these need two clean faces, I took the time to put blue tape on the underside of the cut. I just knew this plywood would tear out, and this left me with a clean edge on both faces. Then I reset my stop, taped the other end, and cut them to their final length. Make sure to leave a little wiggle room for these so you don't damage the finish each time you move a shelf. To prep the shelves for painting, I used some damp dry deck spackle to fill in any scratches, dents, or defects on their faces. I put in just enough to fill the spot and set it aside to dry for a while. Then I can come back and clean it up. I start with a single-edged razor to remove the excess. This prevents the sandpaper from clogging too quickly. Then it's a quick sanding with 150 grit on the random orbit sander. This is one advantage to paint grade work. You can easily hide a lot of errors or crappy plywood. The shelves were set aside for now, and I got out my vintage Kreg K2000 pocket hole jig. Each of the mounting rails got 4 pocket holes, one on either end, and 2 along the long sides, and they're spaced about 10 inches apart. And I made sure to set them in the jig with the banded edge facing up. To install the mounting rails, I added a bead of glue along the underside of the top of the cabinet, set the rail in place along the rabbet for the back, and clamped it in place. Then I drove in the 2 center screws using 1¼ coarse washer head screws. I reset the clamps to hold the outer edges in place and drove in 2 more screws. I repeated this for the underside of the lower shelf as well. Glue, clamps, and screws. The third rail, mounted under the upper shelf, is installed the same way, except it's on the front of the cabinet. This will help support the ladder rail that will be installed later. It's set flush to the front of the cabinet and glued and screwed in place. The other 2 cabinets got their rails installed the same way. Next up was drilling the holes for the adjustable shelves. I got out my Kreg shelf drilling jig, set the stop on the 1/4-inch drill bit, and started drilling the 324 pinholes. I marked the bottom hole on the jig with some blue tape to keep that first hole about 6 inches off the bottom. Then it was drill the holes, move the jig up, set the spacing pin, and drill some more. The center section has 1 more hole than the lower section, so I marked which was the bottom top hole and which was the top hole. Once each side had all its holes drilled, I sanded them with 150 grit on my random orbit sander to clean up any burrs that may have come up. Shifting gears to the face frame, I started ripping down the long pieces I need for the stiles at the table saw. Again, they're a bit wider than I need, so I can clean them up at the next step. And while I was set up, I ripped down the stock for the rails as well. I had 6 rail pieces at 3 inches, and I cleaned them up first. A few passes through the planer removed any saw marks and got them to their final width. Then I could repeat the process for the 2-inch stock, both the long stiles and the shorter rail stock. At the miter saw, I squared one end of each rail stock, both the 3-inch and the 2-inch pieces. I used the setup stick from the bottom cabinet build to set the stop for the rail lengths. With the block clamped in place, I could cut all of the rails to the proper length. I used the same procedure on the stiles, first cutting 1 inch square and then cutting them to length. The catch here is that the stiles are also longer than my miter saw stand. For these, I just mark the length and cut them by eye. Again, the length is not critical, and they can run a bit long on the top as they'll never be seen. I clamp one of the stiles in place and use the actual cabinet to locate the top of the two fixed shelves. I had to get out my story stick for the location of the bottom of the upper rail, and I was happily surprised to see that the shelf locations lined up to the story stick. I could now mark the location of that top rail. I lined up the bottom of the 4 stiles and clamped them together. The tops were off a bit, but again, they'll never be seen. Then I used my square and a mechanical pencil to transfer the lines from the first stile. That fine pencil lead gives me a precise location to work from. I also marked if the rail was to sit above or below this line, just in case. Again, I pulled out my pocket hole jig and drilled 2 holes on either end of all the rails. The assembly was pretty basic, just a bit unwieldy because of the size of everything. One at a time, I lined up my rails at their respective marks on the stiles, set a squaring jig in place to help hold things, added a bit of glue, then clamped the stile and rail together to keep their faces flush. I drove in 2 1/4" fine threaded washer head screws, removed any excess glue, and repeated that for the other 2 rails. The stile and rail assembly was flipped around, and I repeated the process for the other side. The last step was to check the frame for square. With that done, I set it aside and built the opposite face frame. The center section will be done a bit differently. Before fitting the face frames to the cabinets, I wanted to lock them together. Like before, I'm using panel connectors, but since the upper cases are taller, I'll use 6 per side rather than 4 that I used on the base cabinets. Once the boxes were aligned and clamped together, I added a backer strip to minimize any blowout. I drilled a small pilot hole, then followed that with the correct diameter bit for the connectors I'm using. In this case, 13/64. The tape on the bit lets me know that I've gone through both panels and into the backer board. If all goes well, then I should have clean holes on both inside faces of the cabinets. I used 1/4" plywood for the back panels and ripped them to width with my Kreg rip cut. There were 2 challenges here. First, the rip cut has a 24" capacity and my panels are 31 inches wide. So I set it to remove the waste. So what was left on the far side of my blade was the width of my back panels. The second challenge is that this stuff is so light that even being clamped to some longer stock, it still moved around during the cut. It's times like this that I really miss my old cabinet saw. To cut the backs to length, I grabbed my shop-made saw guide, clamped it in place, and trimmed off the excess. The first panel took me 2 tries to get the height just right, but then I cut the other 2 to the exact same size. With the backs temporarily in place, it was time to attach the face frames. I want them to line up with the face frames on the bottom cabinets, so I made another story stick that showed where the stiles are in relation to the cabinet sides. I made one for the left and another for the right. Then I transferred the stile location onto my cabinet, and then I transferred those marks to the top and bottom of each shelf. The face frames were set in place and clamped down in the correct location. Then I could mark the location of the 2 shelves for some biscuits to help keep things aligned during assembly. I cut 3 slots for number 20 biscuits in each shelf. Then I cut the mating slot in the face frame. I ran a bead of glue around the cabinet, added the biscuits, set the face frame in place, clamped it in the correct location, and added some brads to hold things together until the glue dried. The bottom sides of the cabinet were still floppy, so I used my square to make sure I maintained the same overhang at the bottom as I had on the top. I connected the 3 cabinets to make sure that I got everything lined up before moving forward. The center cabinet only has rails installed and they're not attached to the stiles. This will let me move the 3 cabinets individually, but they are installed the same way: glue, biscuits, and brads. First the lower shelf, then the ladder rail. The ladder rail also got 3 screws to help secure it to the rail behind it. The top rail was handled a bit differently. I had an additional backer strip to the top and a biscuit on either side. Again, the biscuits are there just for alignment, and I'll glue them in during the final installation. Then it was glue and brad as before. The right face frame was added just like the left. I made my alignment marks while everything was connected, and happily those marks lined up with the story stick I'd made earlier. And then I went back and filled all the brad holes with the spackle. Like on the bottom, I'm going to need a filler panel on the right side. I started that by ripping the panel slightly oversized with my rip cut and circular saw. At the table saw, I ripped it down to its final width. Reset my fence and cut 2 spacer strips. I drilled the panel connector holes as before with the 2 strips clamped in place. Like on the bottom panel, the panel connectors need to be epoxied in place since I won't have access to the back side later. Each one got a bit of epoxy and they were set so that their barrels were just shy of the panel face. I left them to cure overnight because, again, 5-minute epoxy never is. The next day, I secured the 2 strips in place, added a bit of glue to both sides, and set the side panel in place. The plan was to use 3/4 inch brads to connect them while the glue dried, but my brad nailer seized up. Plan B was to clamp things in place while I dug out my pin nailer. At least now the pinholes are smaller and easier to hide. I removed the side panel and screwed the filler strips in from the back. I know this is a bit like wearing a belt and suspenders, but I wanted to make sure I had a good bond between the strips and the side panel. All of the parts were sanded to 150 grit, and everything got 1 coat of primer. I used my HVLP spray gun and gave the parts an even coat. Not everything needed to be sprayed on both sides, but for the ones that did, I came back about 4 hours later and sprayed those backs. Once the primer dries, it becomes a bit easier to see if any other areas need some filling. I used the same damp spackle and filled any voids I could find. I let that dry and used a single-edged razor like a cabinet scraper to get rid of most of the dried putty. Then everything got a light sanding by hand. 220 grit paper is enough to finish cleaning up the spackle and remove any raised grain from the primer. Now, I don't know if this is true for all primers, but what I use tends to gum up the sandpaper pretty quickly. I probably use it longer than I should, but I do have to change my paper often. Everything gets 2 coats of paint after that. Before the last coat goes down, I fill any remaining gaps and lightly sand any imperfections. Once the paint is dry, the backs are permanently installed. First screwed into the shelves, then stapled into the sides and top. Then it's time for one last pre-assembly. The main focus on this video was building these upper cabinets. And while I tried to show you the process in a logical sequence, just know that in reality it was anything but. I knew there'd be days and days of painting and I had to break that up. So some days I was painting while building others and then paint those after that. If all goes to plan, there should be one more video where I take you along on the installation so you can see how all these pieces come together. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this video. Was there something I could have done differently, easier, smarter? Drop them in the comments below. As usual, I've listed a series of links in the description showing off some of the tools and materials that I use during this build and some of the stuff that I use in most of my builds. And if you need one of those things and buy it through one of those links, just know that it may help support the channel. If you enjoyed this video, maybe give it a thumbs up and share it with friends. If you haven't already, maybe it's time to hit that subscribe button and little bell so you get notified each time I put out a new video. Again, I think I know what's coming up next, but you never know because Sometimes life happens. So until then, have a great day, stay safe, and we'll see you soon.